We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone can hear me? This works? Good. Welcome, everyone, to our Policy in a Pint event. Usually in Calgary, we have this moment where we invite people in attendance to have a beer in a pub and talk about policies in a much more relaxed setting. And our plan when we start to design this in June was to actually have this in person with a beverage. And this is a good indication that things are not back to normal as we're still doing this on Zoom. And it seems as we're going into this topic of this conference, what are the consequences of COVID and the lagging effect on our political and economic system, this is a good indication that we're still stuck on Zoom with each other. Today, we're going to talk about probably one of the most pressing policy issues that we're facing as Canadians and Albertans, and in some respect, kind of a lingering issue on the impact of the COVID pandemic in our political and economic system. When we started this pandemic in March 2020, I don't think a lot of people have put a lot of money on expecting to be still today stuck in that environment and still feeling pretty much the brunt of the impact of a fourth wave in Alberta that doesn't seem to go away. We had a brief respite in a 3-month, with like the shortest open for summer plan ever, and now we're paying the price of this decision. We are convened here to talk and think about certain kinds of issues. What are the actual impact of the global pandemic, but specifically on our sectors like the service and hospitality sector in Calgary and in Alberta? What might be the downstream economic and political impacts to Alberta and the COVID? And we're trying to think about how this COVID pandemic is affecting our daily lives here in Alberta. We are lucky to have two outstanding speakers. First off, Sol Zia, who has a large and an impressive career, 20 years working for, as a senior leadership position in the hospitality sector, working for Canadian Airlines and Air Canada, Sears Travel, Transamerica, McCann Worldwide, Loyalty Air Miles, WestJet, and very much having an anchor into Calgary. He now is at the Calgary Hotel Association, has been working there and very much being at the forefront of the impact of the pandemic in that sector that is nevralgic to Alberta. Secondly, we have Dr. Lisa Young, who's a full professor at the Department of Political Science, and we're lucky to have her at the School of Public Policy. She's an impressive scholar working on everything from electoral reform to elections. We see her all the time. We wonder how come, she's everywhere. I think we've, like at the SPP, we've cloned her 50 times and still are amazed that, she has time for these kinds of events. And we feel very much lucky to have her today. The format is simple. I'll let my speakers talk for 5 to 7 minutes. They'll make brief remarks. Then I'll ask questions that I've prepared, and then I'll go to the audience to talk about the issue. As you can see, my cat somehow has decided to explore, somewhere she never explored ever before. But now that she's on Zoom, she knows that this is like an important part of the experience. And here at SPP, we want to make this as real as possible. So first, I'm going to start off with Sol, and please, you have the floor.
You'd think after all these months of Zoom and Teams, I'd know how to unmute. No, still searching for the mute button. Thank you. Thanks, JC. First of all, thanks for inviting me to participate in your panel today. And I want to say thank you on behalf of the entire travel, tourism, and hospitality sector. I'm going to touch on being hard hit, and we are a hard hit sector. If you go back, and I know JC will be asking questions about looking back into time to 2020 and prior to 2020. But when the pandemic hit in March of last year, governments and policymakers reacted quickly. And the first matters were around civil safety. And our sector, the hotel industry and hospitality industry, met the call to flatten the curve. That was the very first message. The policy was crafted around that. And on one side, we shut down to only essential services, guest rooms for those at that point who were seeking guest rooms for a myriad of reasons. One was proximity to hospitals. But on the other hand, we opened our doors to provide safe shelter to hundreds of vulnerable, almost thousands of vulnerable Calgarians. And subsequently, during phases of the pandemic, and we can clearly now look back and see that there were phases subsequent to that, the original provision around safety to those that needed shelter, especially those who are vulnerable. We then expanded to those seeking quarantine, isolation, or shelter, with or without government support. And keep in mind, many were seeking isolation and shelter without working with levels of government. And keep in mind, we also housed hundreds of nurses and healthcare workers and physicians who didn't want to go home, were working, I don't even know what kind of hours, 18, 20-hour days, and would check into a hotel and then repeat the cycle back to a hospital. But here we are, more than 18 months later, in terms of the impact to the sector. And those decisions all along the way have had massive impacts on our business. The healthcare requirements that came in, the governments that, whether it was federal, provincial, or municipal. And keep in mind, even in this sector, the federal government sure had a great deal to do with travel. Let's keep in mind the government approved accommodation program, GAA as we called it, where it depends on the city, where thousands of folks were stayed in hotels upon return from international destinations. But I'm going to give you a bit of context and bore all of you with some numbers. So far in 2021, and happy to address questions about 2020, the Calgary hotels, and this will translate to dining in restaurants and visiting attractions, such as the Calgary Zoo or attractions we have across the city, but we served under 1 million guests so far in 2021. And keep in mind, for context, in a typical year, we'd be looking at over 2 million guests so far at this point in the year. So after 18 months, and now 3 months after Alberta was declared to be open for summer, and there's other terms that were used as well, we're once again as a sector fighting for our lives, commercially for our lives. And more important, still providing those services during the state of healthcare emergency that we again find ourselves in after that quote unquote best summer ever. To give a few more stats, and I know they're boring, but these volumes and these impacts are monumental. Over the past 18 months, the hotel sector in Calgary alone has lost over $300 million in projected revenue. And we did have to shed, unfortunately, 2,000 jobs to lay off from our workforce. 2,000 hardworking, contributing Calgarians had to be relieved of their positions during layoff. And as we emerge from the pandemic, if we are emerging yet, it's difficult to attract workers back for a myriad of reasons, whether they've moved on to other sectors, or finding government programs more palatable than coming back to a hotel, or just the way people and society are treating hotel workers when they come to hotels. And I'll talk about civil society a little bit later, I think, in the Q&A. And just to give you the wrapper around impact, in 2019, hotel occupancy averaged about 62% across the city of Calgary. We welcomed over 3 million guests to Calgary hotels. And one important thing to keep in mind, and we talked about airports earlier, almost 2 million of those who stayed in hotels in Calgary came through YYC or another major Alberta airport. And we certainly know the impact of the airline industry and what they felt through the pandemic. So once again, also a hard hit sector. So the hotels, hospitality, restaurants, we all sit. Live music. Imagine live music. We got a glimpse of it the past few months. Hopefully we get it back. Collectively, the hardest hit sectors. And I'm going to close off because this was originally intended to be about recovery. And as we look to recover, I think the sector, and I'll say collectively for travel and tourism, we have to strive to first understand what recovery is, and that is a question mark, and when the recovery is coming. I'll close off by saying that for most of the think tanks and analytic groups that serve us and provide us with information, we're not looking to a return of 2019 numbers, and frankly, many of you will find this disturbing, until 2025. Years away from the economic climate we experienced prior to the pandemic, well to the middle of this decade. So we'll close off there. This is the hospitality sector. Typically, we're a microcosm of all the good things in life, but now we're sadly a microcosm of all the things that we missed in life. So I'll close off on that. JC, open to any questions you have, and hopefully Dr. Young can make things a bit more upbeat.
That may be a challenge. Thanks so much, Saul. And what I want to say before I start talking about the political situation is that, as a political scientist, this is about the most fascinating thing I have ever seen. The way that this is playing out in Alberta, as somebody who has studied party politics and electoral behavior and questions of social capital and social cohesion. This is absolutely fascinating. But political scientists are also citizens, and we live in the community that we're talking about. And I think a lot of us on social media saw one of the prominent political commentators in the city break down at the end of an interview because of what we're actually talking about here. And I think that's a really important reminder that we're talking about political gamesmanship and social impacts and so on, but underlying it all are the news that we hear at 3:30 every day. How many people have died today? How many of our healthcare workers are never going to be themselves again because of the trauma of what they're experiencing right now. And so I just want to say, this is more crying in my beer than being upbeat. But I really do feel that when we talk about this as a set of political circumstances, we do have to remember that this is what's at stake, and this is what is happening on the ground every single day. So, anyone who is following this in the local media knows that in Alberta, COVID has become probably the worst political crisis that the government of Alberta has faced in most of our lifetimes. This is unlike anything that most of us have ever seen. Last week, it looked as though we might have a change in leadership. That didn't end up happening. We've had parts of the government caucus freelancing and making announcements that diverge from government policy, which is not something that we typically see. There's certainly the sense that Premier Kenney is in a fight now for his political life, and it's not over, right? I mean, as I said, every day at 3:30 we hear about how many more people have died as a consequence of government policy. So we have clearly a fractured caucus within the UCP. It went into the pandemic not entirely united. I think the sort of merger of the old Wild Rose and progressive conservative parties, I think, had not been fully achieved, nor would you have expected it to. These are two quite different political movements, but we've seen a remarkable fracturing within, under the stress of the pandemic, with the rural-based sort of former Wild Rose caucus really playing an outsized role, I think, in directing government policy and being a constraint on government action. We see a government that is offering less and less transparency, refusing to answer questions about COVID cases in schools, for example, really increasingly avoiding journalists' questions about some of the facts about what's going on. Confidence in the leadership of the Premier, of the Minister of Health, of the Chief Medical Officer of Health have gone down to a greater extent in Alberta than anywhere else in the country, which is obviously a very difficult thing. We walked into the fourth wave with low rates of confidence in these leaders. And so there is no one to turn to as a public face of government under these circumstances. And it appears against the backdrop of all of this that, a lot of the attention and activity in the government of Alberta is focused on managing the Premier's political survival rather than managing the crisis. So, this is not a good situation that we're in by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing that I just want to touch on in the crying in my beer portion of these comments is just to talk really briefly about social cohesion, this idea that we are a community that functions as a cohesive whole. And I was worried about social cohesion in Alberta before the pandemic. There was, certainly when in the 2019 budget, which came down just before COVID really affected us, there was a lot of rhetoric from the government about how public sector workers were unproductive and, a problem. And, we were imagining labor strife in the province. It felt like we were going to a pretty worrisome place. And that obviously has been heightened through the pandemic. We're hearing slightly different rhetoric from government now about, valuing healthcare workers, but also some comments from the government backbench about AHS not doing what it needs to do. We've seen the emergence of an increasingly radicalized group in Alberta society, anti-mask and anti-vaccine protesters, who are, protesting every weekend, if not more often. We just had the Premier announce that, legislation would be used to keep them from protesting in front of hospitals. We hear stories of altercations inside the hospitals as people deny that they might possibly have COVID. I mean, it's really all utterly unimaginable. Tensions within the province between urban and rural, educated and uneducated, are I think worse than they have been certainly in my 25 years in the province, possibly more. And we're in a state of, I think, growing incivility. And so my question is, how do we come back together as a community after all of this is over? So on that cheery note, Jean-Christophe, I will stop talking.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. A lot of questions I have, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Of course, for the audience, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to direct them toward our speakers. I think the first question I have in my mind is, have we learned anything out of our 2 years of this pandemic? It seems to us that good government is also a government that kind of learns from its mistake and kind of tries to do things less badly as it comes out. So here we have a political scientist and somebody that works in the economic sector. And my first question is, have we learned anything? We've been here 18 months. We'll go there 24 months. What has been different from 2020 to 2021? Has there been any progress in any shape or form in kind of the policies that we've put in place? Have we made things worse? Have we made things better? And I'm going to start with Saul to kind of run with the ball on this one.
Thank you. And I'm going to bridge on Dr. Young's closing around civil society. And I do think for the hospitality sector, as a commercial sector, what we learned in 2020 was the application of heightened safety So safety of our guests, which is manifest in safety of society. We learned about new safety practices and delivery of safety all the time, delivering a level of care that we've come to expect from hospitality, whether it's a 2-star hotel or a 5-star hotel. Hotels are a reflection of a civil society and how we treat, how we treat guests and how people treat each other. So we learned a lot about safety and applying safety. Those new applications of safety, whether it's standards of sanitation and cleanliness, were going to persist well beyond the pandemic that we thought, let's be clear, that we'd be out of by the end of 2020. What we see now, and I'll be the first to observe it, and I know amongst my colleagues who run hotels, that erosion in civil society, how people are treated and how we treat each other, is something that I think, whether it's learning or observation, we've seen that erosion. And I talked about the inability to attract workers back to the hotel industry, which we're seeing in restaurants. We've all been to maybe walk by restaurants and say, well, we're closed on Monday. We have a lack of staff. We're closed these days. And imagine those frontline workers who are at the wrong end of where we're at in terms of a society and civil society. Why would you go back to a minimum wage job or an entry-level job where you're afraid of how people will treat you? And we go into these careers in hospitality because we love people, and we like to interact with people, and we like to see those smiling faces and watch when people receive the benefit of a great meal or great service or a great experience. And we're at a point where that's not the impact that workers feel. They feel something different, and it's become an impediment to attracting people back. So, I'm gonna close that with, we learned about safety and new standards in 2020. We didn't get to apply them in 2021, and what we're seeing is, and I see as a breakdown in a level of fear in how we treat each other. That's just manifest. And you can see it in the media in terms of how people whose historically their jobs are there to surprise and delight you, are the first ones to be surprised by how ill they're treated. So that I did spill into 2021, but we learned a lot in 2020, and it's difficult to apply some of that learning in 2021.
Thank you. Cheering. So Lisa, we started off, with a lot of us in 2020 really focusing on when is there going to be a vaccine? Can we get it as fast as possible? So is there a difference between 2020 and 2021 that you see? What kind of policies have we put in place that we've unlearned or learned in 2021? Have we made things better? Have we made things worse? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's so hard sitting here in Alberta, and I think also Saskatchewan, is that we have learned things. We've learned things nationally, internationally. It is possible to manage the situation and have, not everything open, but a reasonable quality of life that doesn't crash the healthcare system. Those lessons are readily available. Look at Ontario, look at Quebec, right? This is entirely possible. And despite that, here we are in Alberta and Saskatchewan in this utterly desperate situation. So the question then becomes, why hasn't there been learning from this? Why are we in this situation when other governments and other provinces are not? And I think we're going to spend a long time taking that apart as the record, the private record maybe becomes a little more available. Where did we go wrong? But I do think, one thing about political leadership is that in order to learn from your mistakes, you need to acknowledge that you've made mistakes. And, that's an observation that I think probably resonates here in Alberta.
Right. I mean, you would think that after 4 wave, maybe after wave number 2, you've learned things, to kind of undo this, right? And And you're right. All right. So next question. I'm sorry, I have a cat moving on. All right. Next question. I want you like to kind of help you kind of move forward and kind of stay away from 2021 and look at 2022 because it's actually coming, which is surprising. And here I think I'm going to go to Saul first again, right? How do we rebuild our hospitality sector? What kind of policies can be put in place, either at the federal level, at the provincial level, at the municipal level, that would, help that sector kind of recover slowly but surely, but also safely in an environment that at least makes this a little bit more certain for businesses?
Thanks. Yeah. And thankfully we're on Zoom because maybe this would be an unpopular answer if we were live at a pub or the Junction. But I'm actually going to defend, I don't deal with the Premier on a day-to-day basis, but I do deal with other ministries who have admitted that the government has made mistakes, that there were mistakes made along the way. And one of the things that I'll applaud a few of the ministries of is observing what other jurisdictions are doing well. As Albertans, we love to criticize British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, but I will acknowledge that the government, some ministries have recognized the mistakes and are looking at the best of what our neighbors in BC, love them or hate them, our neighbors a bit further away in Ontario and Quebec are doing. And as we look to 2022, some of those approaches are, let's say, more staggered and a little less big bang. We'll look back at summer of 2021. So I know it's not about 2021, it's about 2022, but it was a bit of a big bang in terms of how we opened. And we saw jurisdictions like BC and Ontario take a more measured approach. Maybe we laughed at them. Maybe we scoffed at what they did. But they're seeing the benefit now in terms of a more consistent reopening. They're moving into 2022 with measures in place, safety. They've gone from 100 people at a concert to 200, versus going from 0 people at a concert to thousands. And I do hope that the government and certain ministries, once again, I don't work with the Premier, are looking at those approaches that our neighboring jurisdictions have had. Because I think in 2022, those careful, measured approaches to safety and the gathering of people, hotels are gathering places. You go to your room, but the rest of the time you're circulating. It's a gathering place. And it's also a place where the movement of people is very important. How people move through, look at a convention center or a large meeting room, right? We've learned a lot. And I think 2022 will be an occasion to showcase how we safely house people, how they gather, and how they move. I think how people move is more important than ever in terms of events and concerts and conferences and attending the arts, live music. And we are watching, I know some of the ministries are watching those reopenings in BC and Ontario that are happening now while we're quote unquote shutting down again in this state of healthcare emergency. And I do think that learning, and I put a lot on that safe movement of people, is something that will be interesting. Yeah, I don't know what the numbers, it's going to take a long time for our sector to recover to the numbers we've had before, but it'll be interesting to watch how we do move out of this and how people move at our events and myriad of events. So that's what I see for 2022 is with more than a little bit of interest, but it'll be interesting regardless. Thanks.
Right. So what I'm taking out of this is stop the Albertan fantasy with boom and bust environment and more incrementalism in terms of policymaking. And that would work. Yeah. Lisa, same question, right? Like, how do we rebuild social trust, right? We've gone through a federal election that's been rough. In some respect, we're still much of a divided country over all sorts of issues around vaccination, vaccine uptake, vaccine mandate. What kind of policies can we put in place that actually brings us away? I hear a lot of people talk about like leadership, and leadership has we can put a lot on leadership, and it seems like it's a silver bullet that if you don't have it, like you have nothing, and if you have it, then you have everything. But is there like ways for us to kind of nudge this society into something that is more civil, or do we have to wait for the pandemic to stop? Like, I actually don't know the answer, and I'm like wondering what do you think about this?
Yeah. I think this is it. This is a really challenging thing to do, and I'm not sure that you can do it and take leadership off the table, to be perfectly frank. But I do think it's really important, for governments to focus on openness and transparency. When we see a drop in trust in government, then it is the right time to be, as open and as transparent as you possibly can be, to rebuild that, because it is in everybody's best interests. But maybe we can think about this in a slightly different way as well. I'm a political scientist. I study public policy, so I'm really inclined to think that government is the answer to everything. But maybe I can just broaden out beyond that a little bit, because there's other places for leadership as well, and that can be from the business community, it can be from the not-for-profit sector, right? And if we think about who the leaders are in the Calgary community, in many respects, yes, government matters, but there are so many of the non-governmental organizations and agencies whose directors are leaders in the community, and we've seen them come together around all sorts of initiatives in the past. And we've seen, the corporate sector and the not-for-profit sector cooperate on all sorts of things in the past. And, government is sometimes at the table and sometimes not at the table. But I think, that same kind of spirit that's gone into the idea of ending homelessness in Calgary needs to go into the idea of rebuilding civility in Calgary. And it's not just a Calgary problem. It's, it's broader than this. But, for us right here, I do think that we need to sort of look to community leaders to see what we can do to bring ourselves back together as a community as we move out of the pandemic.
Right. I mean, I'm a political scientist. I also think that government are the answer of anything. And I take your point about leadership, and we can find leadership in different pockets, and hoping that we'll have one savior is probably unrealistic, and hoping that every one of us will find leadership elsewhere. Good leadership is always, like we see good leadership in moments of crisis, and this is where we see the mental of people. They either do not rise up to the occasion, and sometimes some of them do. We have one question out. I have like a lot of other questions that I can throw, but I want to go to the audience. We have one question, so we're going to ask it. And it's something that I've been like talking to myself and asking myself, being out from Eastern Canada, and thinking about this. Some people, I think in Alberta, are starting slowly but surely to wonder whether or not Alberta is a place where they want to continue to live and to grow. In some respect, Alberta shed some people for the last year, and in some ways, a lot of people are asking whether or not the kinds of policies that we've made for ourselves and made maybe the pandemic worse has pushed people to kind of move away. So what are the realistic options for individuals or businesses that are left to deal with, the lack of policy making at the provincial level, and where should they go from there? I'll start with Lisa. Well, I went to Saul often, so now I want to like switch things.
I was hoping that Saul would take this one, because it's a really tough question. And, I think many of us have been there in the past year or year and a half. And, add to that, Alberta wasn't in a great place before the pandemic. If we think back, the industry that has been so important to the province is in transition, high rates of unemployment, social tensions. So that adds to this whole sense. You layer on top of that this sense of discontent with the government and unhappiness with some of our fellow citizens, right? I mean, I think that's something I'm personally struggling with quite a lot. And I guess what I would say is that one of the the happy stories, maybe I should have gone with this earlier on. One of the happy stories, I think, of the pandemic has been the extent to which other governments have really risen to the occasion under some pretty tough circumstances. If we look to, the city council in Calgary and Edmonton, they have been willing to do the things that the province really hasn't been willing to do. We've seen school boards step in and insist, right? And so, a province is more than its provincial government. And I do think that those, other areas, other layers of government have really done a lot. And so, that's the reminder that it's very important to go out and vote on October 18th.
Right. And the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, for example, is a place where I thought were aggressive in kind of pushing for policies that were at odds with the provincial. And often I was like kind of interested to look where leadership can bring you and people taking stance. I also think about the Stampede group, right? They've put in place strong measures to mitigate the impact of pandemic when they were there, and they got a lot of pushback on forcing, a vaccine mandate essentially when everybody else didn't want that. And I think that kind of took for some courage to actually do it. Saul?
Sure, I'll add on to that. And I'm going to jump on that term mass ineptitude. There have been, I think, JC, you mentioned we should have learned through wave 2 to wave 3 to wave 4. But what we have learned is when there's a lack of direction in a vacuum, businesses have come in. And you raised a good point about the Chamber of Commerce coming through with a very strong policy stance on Alberta adopting a vaccination passport, which is now the restriction exemptions program. And ourselves and many other not-for-profits and associations fully supported the chamber in that and gave them support and legs to reach that. But I think Alberta business we are a province of enterprise. I guess we rarely, or maybe we didn't observe as much need for direction in the past or notice the lack of direction, but we certainly had to come in with, I talked about for 2020 safety standards, but for 2021 movement of people, and you mentioned the Stampede. And throughout Stampede and other businesses, we have adopted rigorous standards where the government has not demanded it in order to provide safety for people gathering and for people moving. And I think that I don't need a crystal ball to know that we're going to have to continue doing that. We're going to have to meet or exceed standards. Dr. Young does bring up a good point. I'm going to close on that for my answer. But when we've needed to, we have appealed to municipal governments and other, whether it's the chamber representing us, the not-for-profit side, but the city to come and say, okay, look, we can't leave businesses. Businesses aren't police forces. We should not be. It's not what we're made of. It's not a service we can deliver. So we have, in those instances where the provincial government has not been able to provide direction or policy, have asked the city. And I think chances are strong we'll have to do that again. And to Dr. Young's point, please do vote in the municipal elections, because that incoming council and incoming mayor, it'll be vital for the sort of support businesses will need moving forward. Thanks.
Right. I mean, politics, usually despises emptiness, right? So at one point, some level of government will fill the void. If the federal government doesn't do something, the provincial governments will do it. And if the provincial governments are not doing it, the other levels of government will do it. So I think there's a silver lining in kind of like this multi-layered of policy making that we have in Canada. Here, an interesting question, and I think that's a good question. In some ways, has our mismanagement of the crisis essentially fragilize us, and do we stand the risk of losing out economically because of reputational damage? And I think we could split in two ways. Nationally, right? In some ways, does Alberta nationally has dramatically impaired its reputation, and internationally. And for a business sector that is a lot of tourists that are national and international, that matters a lot. So I'm interested to see your response on this, Saul.
Happy to take this one because, well, or maybe unhappy. The answer is yes. And to your point, we've seen national and international reputational damage, whether we want to call it a black eye or a stain. But what we're seeing is a diversion to other markets. So let's use a case in point of an international society, standard society, engineers, who might have traditionally considered Calgary with our backdrop of Banff and resorts as an ideal place to host a conference or to gather. We know already that those sorts of global associations and societies and national are looking at other jurisdictions because of those things, previous answers, how those jurisdictions are managing safety of movement of people and how people are gathering, and where we've had a vacuum or worse, not delivered policy that guarantees or does its best to guarantee the safety of people. We certainly are in a period of reputational damage and we have to recover. We're going to have to overcompensate for that damage because other jurisdictions are demonstrating effective policy and maturity that we're not. And I already know that we are under the microscope from international bodies and even US bodies who do lead the gathering of people in societies and associations who are reluctant. Diversion is one word, and reluctant to consider Alberta. And we're going to have to do a lot of work collectively to recover from that reputational damage. Thanks.
That's a great answer. Lisa, in terms politically and socially, the West want in, but does the in want the West in some ways?
It says something quite nice about the rest of Canada that, many of us are getting emails from elsewhere in the country or phone calls to sort of say, how's it going in Alberta? Are you okay? The backdrop that we are going to have to our equalization referendum is really quite something. It seems to me that people are going to go out and vote in this equalization referendum as Canadian Forces planes are flying overhead, transporting patients out of our ICUs potentially, right? Canada has come to the rescue despite the fact that we in Saskatchewan have gotten ourselves into this terrible mess. So, we saw probably that it had an impact in the federal election, that it hurt the Conservative Party. But yeah, I mean, there's a political reputation issue here. And, if the outcome of the equalization referendum is to say that, we want to do away with equalization, everyone in Alberta needs to get ready for the rest of the country to really make fun of us because we're asking for it.
Yes. I mean, I was in Montreal last week and I was running around with my piece of paper of my vaccination record. And every time I showed this to go to restaurants, people were like, oh, you're an Albertan. And there was like a tint of shame that, my province couldn't give me a QR code to just do things simply. And I felt this was, just a sting. Here, a question about our investment in the oil and gas, and I'm going to try to kind of formalize this. The UCP have made the oil and gas and the investment in the oil and gas kind of one of the specific policy area that they wanted to push into. And what are the risks of continued energy investment in Alberta when we cannot, we cannot get the social and the economic and governance with COVID? In what way, and I think Saul kind of hinted at this, in what way our incapacity to actually manage this crisis, both from the governance perspective and the social perspective, kind of hinders, future, investment in Alberta on the oil and gas sector? I think this is a good question, and what can be done. And I think that's at one point we'll have another government that will be either NDP or CP, and that government will be, will have a responsibility to do something about this. What can be done? Lisa, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are two issues here. The first is, how viable is the government's strategy to make the claim about the sort of social value of oil and gas production, right? And certainly the way that they've gone about doing this with the energy room and so on has not done a great deal of good for that cause. But I do think, to the extent that to the extent that we want to pursue this industry and make claims about, environmental standards, social and governance contributions, there needs to be a solid policy framework for that. The government needs to be deeply invested in it. It's not about, telling stories about, how this isn't a problem, or making fun of children's cartoons or whatever it is that they're doing. There actually needs to be serious action. And this is a case where industry is clearly so far ahead of government. Elsewhere, I think there's a conversation about how government can set up a framework that corporations can conform to give greater weight to ESG. In this instance, I wonder if government needs to get out of the way and let the corporations lead.
Saul?
That was a great segue into mine, Lisa. Corporations need to lead. And I'm going to give a broader answer. We do need a government that is pro-business. We do need to support oil and gas, right? That is a staple sector of ours. And I'm going to bridge into a very myopic. Calgary is a corporate city, and our hospitality sector is dominated by corporate travel. Our hotels are filled with or used to be filled with corporate travelers. So we need a government that is supportive of business, but also of diversifying sectors as well that are driving a lot of business for hospitality, film and TV, scientific, technology. In addition to oil and gas, we do need a government that's supporting, and equal is a big word, but supporting where it's required, that revitalization and return to what is a corporate city. And my sector won't come back until we see corporate travel. And I'll go back to my previous answer, even amongst oil and gas leaders, they are having a moratorium on corporate travel, right? So the Maverick and Cowboy sector is also paying attention to safety and standards, and are also employing corporate travel restrictions to our area through to spring of next year. Now, I'm going to temper that with, they're not the only ones, but safe, responsible government that is simultaneously pro-business but is making the right decisions. That's what my sector needs. We're not the salvation to a revitalization of business, but we certainly are a metric. Hotels being full and a vibrant downtown is a positive symptom of a strong business environment. Thanks.
Good answer. Okay, so we don't have any more questions, so I'll just do my own questions, which is great, which means that I have to ask all sorts of things that I want to ask. So I'm thinking about right now about the impact of the exclusion program and how that was implemented, both from a political kind of social way and as an economic tool for businesses. So I'd like to kind of think about and ask Saul, like, how did the exclusion program and the way it was designed by the government kind of hindered or helped the industry kind of move forward to a more safety kind of environment?
Well, where I gave some positive cues to the government earlier, I'm going to be fairly negative now. It's been nothing short of a disaster in terms of how it's been implemented. So yes, we've adopted the restriction exemption program, vaccination passport, But I'm going to quote government that we're putting it in, but businesses have to police it. So, and I'm quote unquote, we're not going to be putting in any procedures, anything to reinforce, anything to enforce this. Really, when it came out last week, it's up to you. We're going to randomly audit businesses. That was the statement. I'm like, well, and that's basically been a disaster, because a random audit is hardly an invocation of policy. It's do it if you feel like. And what we're seeing is, and you'll see it in the media and you see it anecdotally, a myriad of businesses, good people, who are applying the restriction exemption program under their own standards, which is not the case in BC and Ontario and Quebec. You talked about Montreal. They have adopted some level of discipline to the introduction of it and enforcement. We're left with a government that has said, we're going to, this is the program, adopt it, or randomly check you out. That is no way to deliver a program of exemption, the vaccine passport. So I'm going to say it, and it's been a disaster in terms of how it's been implemented provincially, and that's simply the case.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can't even remember what the stupid name of the policy, and I call it an exclusion program or something like this, because it's, it's convoluted and it's designed in a way to be convoluted, which is probably the worst part of a policy. If a policy is complicated, people won't do it properly, and you'll not get the impact that you want to make. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about these kinds of programs, which, every other jurisdiction is putting in place, so it's pretty easy to learn from other jurisdictions how to do it well. You first of all, you want it to be an incentive for people to get vaccinated, and so that means that there shouldn't be an easy way around it. You shouldn't be able to get a test that says that you're COVID negative, because then you've lost the incentive to vaccinate, right? So there's that. You also shouldn't be able to cheat the program. The form fillable PDF was just a massive fail, right? But then the second thing, and I think this must be really important for restaurants and hockey teams and others, that if you want people to come back, they need to have confidence in the system, right? And so that means not just that it's easy to administer, but that you think that it's actually working, right? And so if you think that there are people who are forging vaccine passports, or that restaurants aren't going to enforce the system or whatever, then people who are more cautious are not going to venture back out, because there's no sense that this does deliver the kind of guarantee about safety that they're looking for, right? So it just, as a policy implementation failure, we're going to be teaching it for years.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the consistency of what I've seen in Quebec and elsewhere, like gives you the sense of safety, where I know that this is well done and done seriously. An interesting question here about I think that's true. Albertans have are self-critical, and we have a tendency to be extremely negative toward our leaders. And in some respect, other jurisdictions have, had a hard time at the beginning of the pandemic, whereas now we're having a hard time at the end of the pandemic, or the fourth wave. So here the question is is it maybe we're being too hard on our politicians, and maybe other jurisdictions have done it badly also, and we tend to kind of compare wrongly these cases. What are your thoughts about that? I should check somebody, right? Lisa, I'll start with you.
Okay. I mean, what I'll say is that Alberta, I think by virtue of having a pretty professionalized media, and just sort of the political dynamics of the cities in some ways, has been very critical. And you could certainly argue maybe too critical in the second and third waves. This wave, I think it's appropriately critical. But I want to throw this back at you, Jean-Christophe, because I think one of the things that baffles me as a political scientist is how the government of Quebec did not drop in popularity back in the first wave when the outcome was so absolutely disastrous. It has been, every time I look at polling, I look at that and I say, I do not understand the dynamic here. So I think you should answer that one.
And I don't know. I mean, I've lived too long now in Alberta to be a proper, to properly be like a Quebecer. I think, and the measures and the lockdown that they've done was way worse than whatever we had. When I see, like Albertans criticize the government for a mask mandate, whereas in Montreal, I was calling my brother and it was like, I have to go home now, it's 8 o'clock. So like, why? Well, there's a curfew and we've been under curfew for like 2 months and they were taking this like very seriously. And somehow, with the curfew, with the lockdowns, with like being extremely aggressive in mitigating the impact of the pandemic, like the popularity of the government kind of stayed in line. And I'm going to spitball here and kind of think about like what they did well that others. First, they were consistent. The Quebec government put in place policies and they were consistent about the messaging, what they wanted to achieve, and they pushed through all of it. They didn't do this kind of like, let's be open, not open, mask, half mask, maybe not on Sundays, maybe on Wednesdays, maybe it's half a mask day. Like they haven't done this. They were like full in, this is a pandemic, this is serious, people are dying in long-term care facilities. Let's put this in place right away. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think it speaks to what Saul and you were talking about. They've learned through the pandemic, right? So in the grand scheme of things, the Quebecers put in place very restrictive measures in 2020 and stayed with this and incrementally kept those restrictions in place, where now they're benefiting from being extremely aggressive. And I think learning from the first wave explains why now there's not enough, like there's not a lot of transmissions, there's not a lot of death, whereas Alberta kind of did the other way around. We were extremely aggressive the first wave and then dramatically kind of dropped the ball and were slow to respond in the second, third, and fourth wave. And we're like slower and slower to respond to these crises as they come around. So there's a kind of a lack of learning. Thirdly, vaccination rate in Quebec are higher than anywhere. They're extremely aggressive, and although there are anti-vaccine movements in Quebec, they were able to pull really fast a lot of that vaccination. There's arguments in Quebec. I don't know if I buy it, but there's an argument in Quebec that this sense of collective, like sense of belonging to a collectivity, this sense of nationalism and belonging to a community, and that strong sense of social cohesion kind of creates all these externalities where under a crisis they come together, they anchor down, they get vaccinated, they do what they have to do and kind of come out of it better. Whereas in some respect, Alberta and somewhat Saskatchewan are more atomized, more individualistic societies, and thus don't come together as they're coming around. And that has been kind of a weird sentiment for me looking at this. I was expecting Alberta kind of come together. I was expecting like Alberta to be like Alberta strong, right? And I was expecting the government to say like Alberta strong and vaccinated and kind of pull together that message of community that is at the center of a traditional conservative way of seeing this, right? Like family, community. And that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is more and more individualistic behaviors kind of being rewarded. Oh, if you don't want to get vaccinated, I'll give you $100. Maybe that's going to be like make you do this. People, blatantly, like going out of their way to push back on vaccine mandates, on mask mandates, aggressing people in the hospitality sector, and that kind of incivility seems to be very aggressive and very weird in Alberta. So in some ways, there's a lot of criticism in Quebec, but they have been able to essentially put in place policies that make it work. But I don't know if that's true, and we'll need a lot of comparative data and very, like, for political scientists, it's like wonderful. We'll have like a lot of work to be done. So I'm going over. Of course, thank you so much for being with us. There's a question about Quebec, and I send me an email, and I don't know, and we can ask about this. I'd like to first thank both of my panelists, Sol Zia and Dr. Lisa Young, for being there, and again, and coming on Zoom to talk about this interesting issue. I somewhat think that we've moved the thing toward the future, which I think is kind of important. We feel stuck in the present, and somehow the present is gloom, and maybe the future is better. I'd like to thank everyone who attended on this. It's a Tuesday, Monday, or I don't even know, Tuesday. It's a Zoom Tuesday. So thank you for coming and being with us, and hopefully everyone can be safe in the future.